Something has been weighing on your heart, a feeling you can't shake, a presence that lingers when you're alone in the dark. At first, it was nothing, just a thought, a fleeting moment. But now it haunts you, a heaviness in your soul, an unshakable emptiness that no pleasure seems to fill. You tell yourself it's nothing, that everyone does it, that it's just human nature. But deep inside, something is wrong. You feel it when you wake up in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, your heart racing for no reason. You feel it when the silence around you becomes deafening, and you realize this isn't just in your mind. Something is happening, something you can't see. You've tried to ignore it. You've told yourself it's just guilt, that these thoughts will pass. But they don't. They only grow stronger. And then the dreams started. Dreams of darkness, of voices calling your name, of shadows standing at the foot of your bed. At first, you dismissed them. But now you're starting to wonder if there's something more. What if I told you that you're not imagining things? That this feeling, this weight on your soul is real? That there is something happening? Something spiritual? Something devastating? What if I told you that Padre Pio warned about this very thing? That he saw what no one else could? That he knew the truth hidden beneath what the world tells you is normal? Because the truth is, there is a war being waged for your soul. And you may not even realize that you're already losing. There's a reason you feel this way. There's a reason you can't escape it. And there's a reason that people who have gone too far never seem to find peace again. Because what you think is harmless, what the world tells you is just a part of life, could be the very thing pulling you into spiritual darkness. Padre Pio spoke of a terror so great, so devastating, that most people don't realize they've fallen into it until it's too late. But you still have time. Because tonight we're going to expose it. We're going to uncover the truth that no one wants you to know. We're going to dive into the warnings, the consequences, and most importantly, the way out. But be warned. Once you hear this, you'll never look at things the same way again. Before we begin, if you're new here, make sure you subscribe. This isn't just another video. This is a message that could change your life, and you don't want to miss what comes next. Now, are you ready to know the truth? Because what happens next will haunt you. Liam never thought much about the weight of his choices. He was young, full of life, and convinced that he was in control. His desires were natural, weren't they? The world told him they were. Friends laughed about them. Movies glorified them. Society encouraged them. And so, he gave in, time and time again, telling himself that it was normal. At first, it felt exhilarating, like he had discovered something powerful, something that made him feel alive. There was no harm in it, or so, he thought. It was just part of being human. A fleeting moment of pleasure, a release, a rush that came and went, leaving him with nothing but a lingering sense of satisfaction. But then, something changed. The pleasure wasn't as fulfilling as before. It no longer gave him the same rush. It was like a fire that once burned brightly but was now fading, requiring more and more to keep it alive. He needed it, craved it, and the more he fed it, the hungrier it became. Yet, he ignored the warning signs, the emptiness creeping into his heart. The restless nights staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was missing. The sense that, no matter how much he indulged, he was never truly satisfied. Liam had always considered himself a free man. He did what he wanted, when he wanted, with no guilt attached. But one evening, after another fleeting pursuit, he looked at himself in the mirror. And for the first time, he didn't recognize the man staring back. His eyes were empty. His soul felt drained. And then, the nightmares began. At first, they were just strange dreams, images flashing through his mind that he quickly dismissed when he woke up. But night after night, they grew darker, more intense. He found himself wandering in a desolate place surrounded by whispering voices, shadows moving in the corners of his vision. He could hear laughter, mocking, cruel, distant, yet terrifyingly close. Then, one night, he woke up gasping for air, his chest tight with an overwhelming weight he couldn't explain. A suffocating darkness filled his room, an invisible force pressing down on him as if something unseen was watching, waiting. He turned to distractions, music, television, more indulgence, but nothing silenced the growing unease, and that's when the thoughts started creeping in. What if this isn't just my imagination? What if something is happening to me, something I can't see? Liam shook off the idea. He was being ridiculous. There was no such thing as spiritual consequences for things that were just normal, right? But deep inside, he felt the pull. It wasn't just in his mind anymore. It was real. One evening, while scrolling mindlessly through his phone, something caught his eye. A quote, one he had never seen before, one that seemed to leap out at him as if meant just for him. The sins of the flesh do more harm to the soul than any other. They consume, they enslave, they destroy. Padre Pio. His stomach twisted. The words unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. He tried to scroll past, to forget them, but they echoed in his mind, over and over again. Destroy. That word haunted him. Had he been destroying himself without even realizing it? For the first time, Liam questioned everything he had believed about, his choices. What if this wasn't harmless? What if there was something more at play, something unseen, something that had been quietly pulling him further and further into a darkness he never noticed? And if that was true, what would happen if he didn't stop? What if the nightmares weren't just dreams? What if the weight on his soul wasn't just guilt, but something far worse? A war was happening, and he was in the middle of it. But he didn't know if he had the strength to fight. Liam had always considered himself a rational man. He believed in what he could see, what he could touch. The concept of spiritual battles, of unseen forces waging war over the souls of men, had always felt distant, something from ancient texts, warnings from old priests that no longer applied to modern life. But now, things were changing, and he was beginning to wonder if he had been blind all along. The first sign was the dreams. At first, they were nothing more than strange, fleeting images, shadows moving in the periphery of his mind, whispers he couldn't quite understand. He would wake up with an odd sense of unease, but he always managed to push it aside. After all, dreams were just dreams, weren't they? But as the nights passed, the dreams grew darker. The shadows were no longer vague. They were there, watching him. He could feel them, an oppressive weight pressing down on his chest. In the dreams, he wandered through endless hallways, doors opening to reveal nothing but blackness. Voices, calling his name from places he could not see. And then, the worst part, he would wake up, gasping for air, only to find that the feeling had followed him into the waking world. The darkness was no longer confined to his sleep. It was bleeding into his reality. During the day, he tried to ignore it. He kept himself busy, surrounded himself with noise, with people. But no matter how much he tried to distract himself, the feeling was always there, lingering in the background like an invisible weight pressing down on his shoulders. A creeping emptiness that grew heavier with each passing day. Then, the presence began to make itself known. It started subtly, objects slightly out of place when he knew he hadn't touched them. A chill in the air despite the summer heat, the nagging sensation that he was being watched even when he was alone. He would sit in his apartment at night, staring at his phone, scrolling mindlessly through social media, but the feeling never left. It was as if something was standing just behind him, waiting. Liam tried to tell himself it was paranoia. Maybe he was just overworked, exhausted. Maybe the dreams were messing with his head, but deep down, he knew. This wasn't just stress. This wasn't just a trick of his imagination. The anxiety followed him everywhere. It clung to him like a second skin, made his heartbeat quicken for no reason. He would sit in a crowded room and feel utterly alone. He would hear laughter and wonder why it sounded hollow. Even the things he used to enjoy now felt empty, meaningless. A void had opened inside him, and no matter what he did, he couldn't fill it. And then, one night, the silence became unbearable. He was lying in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The room was dark, but it was more than just the absence of light. It was a heavy, suffocating darkness, thick and unnatural. He felt it pressing against his skin, a cold dread creeping up his spine. He turned on his side, willing himself to fall asleep, but just as he was drifting into unconsciousness, a sound cut through the silence. A whisper. At first, he thought he had imagined it, but then it came again, soft, insidious, like a breath against his ear. He sat up abruptly, heart pounding, scanning the room for any sign of movement. Nothing, just the shadows stretching along the walls, unmoving, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. He wasn't alone. He knew it with absolute certainty. Panic clawed at his throat. He reached for his phone, turned on the flashlight, sweeping it across the room. Everything was where it should be. Nothing was out of place. And yet the air was thick with something unseen, something malevolent. He could feel it watching him from the dark corners of the room, waiting. He swallowed hard, gripping the phone, tighter. He needed to get out. He needed to breathe. Liam stumbled out of bed, flicking on every light as he moved through his apartment. The brightness pushed back the shadows, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside him. His thoughts were racing, his pulse hammering against his ribs. Was he losing his mind? Was this just exhaustion? Or was it something worse? A memory surfaced, unbidden, a passage he had read long ago but had never taken seriously. The devil does not sleep, but seeks to ruin souls in 1,000 ways. A chill ran through him. Could this be what was happening to him? Had he unknowingly invited something into his life? He had never considered the spiritual consequences of his actions before. He had always lived by his own rules, done what he pleased. But now, the choices he had once dismissed as harmless seemed to weigh on him with unbearable force. That night, Liam sat in his living room with every light on, his Bible untouched on the shelf beside him. He hadn't opened it in years. He wasn't sure if he even believed anymore. But something deep inside told him that if there was ever a time to seek the truth, it was now. The darkness was real. The emptiness was real. And if what he was feeling was the result of the path he had walked, then maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to turn back before it was too late. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt something watching you in the dead of night? Have you ever experienced a presence that you couldn't explain? A weight on your soul that wouldn't lift? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about it. You are not alone. Liam sat in his car, the engine running, but he couldn't bring himself to move. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel as if holding on for dear life, but even that couldn't calm the storm inside him. The noise in his head was relentless, like 1,000 voices screaming all at once, accusing him, condemning him, and dragging him further into the depths of despair. He tried to push the thoughts away, tried to silence the shame that seemed to pulse in his chest like a drumbeat he couldn't escape. But it was there, a constant reminder of his failures, a never-ending cycle that grew stronger each time he fell into temptation. "You're unworthy of love," one voice whispered, its tone chilling. "You'll never be good enough for God. Not after everything you've done." Liam flinched as the words echoed through his mind. It wasn't the first time he had heard them, and deep down, he knew they weren't wrong. He had tried to ignore the guilt, to push it down, and pretend it wasn't there. But it was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, ready to resurface and drag him under. It had started innocently enough. At first, it was just a little indulgence here and there, a moment of weakness. But slowly, it escalated. The more Liam gave in to his desires, the more the guilt mounted. He would leave one sinful encounter only to feel a fleeting sense of satisfaction, but it was always short-lived. The satisfaction would fade, leaving behind a cold emptiness that nothing could fill. No amount of pleasure, no matter how fleeting, could erase the hollow feeling that consumed him afterward. It was as if every act of sin carved a deeper wound into his soul, and he couldn't stop himself from spiraling further. "You think God will forgive you?" Another voice sneered, more mocking now. "You're too far gone. There's no way back from this. You've ruined everything." Liam squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder. They were inside his head, inside his heart, reminding him of every moment of weakness, every time he had strayed. Each time he gave in to temptation, each time he betrayed his values, the voices in his mind grew more insistent, more demanding. It was as if they were feeding on his guilt, growing stronger with every mistake he made. He felt like a prisoner, locked in a cell with no key. He had tried to pray once or twice, but even that felt hollow now. The words of his prayers felt empty, like they were bouncing off a wall, unheard and unanswered. He couldn't bring himself to believe that God was still listening. How could he when Liam was so lost, so broken? The darkness was suffocating. It wasn't just a feeling. It was a weight that pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Every day felt like a struggle to stay afloat, to keep his head above the water. But no matter how hard he fought, the waves of guilt kept pulling him under. "God won't forgive you," the voice whispered again. "You've sinned too much. You've betrayed him too many times. He's disgusted with you. You're beyond saving." Liam couldn't shake the thought. What if the voice was right? What if there was no way back for him? The idea that he was too far gone to be saved consumed him. Every time he tried to pick himself up, the weight of his past mistakes dragged him back down. It wasn't just the voice in his head that tormented him. It was the emptiness inside, the overwhelming sense of spiritual barrenness that seemed to stretch on endlessly. He tried to distract himself with work, with friends, with anything that could fill the silence, but it never worked. Nothing could fill the void that had opened up in his soul. The darkness that clung to him felt permanent, like a stain that couldn't be washed away. But it wasn't just the sin itself that haunted him. It was the terror of what would happen next, of what would become of him if he continued down this path. He could feel the spiritual terror wrapping around him like a suffocating fog, pulling him deeper into a spiritual abyss. He was lost, and he didn't know how to find his way back. The fear was paralyzing. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see it, an endless void stretching out before him, with no light at the end, no hope to guide him. He had heard stories of people who had lost their way, who had wandered so far from God that they could never return. Was that going to be his fate? Would he be one of those souls who would remain trapped in the darkness forever? The idea of being separated from God, of never feeling his love or forgiveness again, was the most terrifying thought of all. It was a fear so deep, so primal, that it threatened to consume him entirely. He couldn't imagine a life without the comfort of God's grace, without the hope of redemption. But that's how it felt, like he was already slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "God doesn't care about you anymore," the voice hissed, twisting the knife deeper. "He's turned his back on you. You're on your own." It was in those moments that Liam felt the most alone. The terror, the shame, the guilt. It was all-consuming. He wanted to scream, to beg for help, but the words wouldn't come. He was frozen in place, trapped in his own mind, with no escape. But even in the midst of this torment, a small, faint whisper of hope began to break through. It was so quiet at first, so small, that Liam barely noticed it. It was the thought that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't beyond saving. That maybe, even in the midst of his failures, there was a way out. For the first time in a long while, Liam dared to wonder if God could still love him, even in his brokenness. The terror that had held him captive began to loosen its grip, ever so slightly, as a flicker of light pierced the darkness. But this wouldn't be easy. The road ahead would be long, and the voices in his head would not stop. But for the first time and ages, Liam felt something shift inside him, a tiny spark of hope that could grow if he allowed it. And maybe, just maybe, that spark would be enough to light the way back to God. Liam walked the streets in a daze, barely registering his surroundings. The weight of the world pressed heavily on his shoulders, the guilt of his past sins suffocating him at every turn. It had been weeks since the terror inside him first began, to claw at his soul, but it felt like a lifetime. Every step he took, every breath he drew, was laden with the overwhelming sense that he was lost to his own desires, lost to his guilt, and perhaps lost to God himself. The voices in his mind had only grown louder in the days since, accusing him, berating him, reminding him of his unworthiness. He had no peace, no solace, no escape. The terror of being separated from God, of being cast into the darkness forever, gripped him tighter with every passing moment. He had tried to find comfort in many things, work, distractions, fleeting moments of pleasure, but they only left him feeling emptier, more broken than before. He couldn't outrun the darkness that followed him wherever he went, nor could he silence the voices that tormented him at night. He knew he had to do something. But what? Where could he go? Who could possibly understand the depth of the anguish he was experiencing? It was then that he heard about a man, a priest, whose very name brought a sense of calm to those who had heard it. Padre Pio. A man known for his deep connection to God, a man who had the gift of understanding human suffering in a way that seemed almost supernatural. People spoke of him in hushed tones, describing his ability to heal the broken, to offer peace where none seemed to exist. Liam had heard these stories before, but they had always felt distant, like tales of someone he could never reach. But now, in the midst of his spiraling despair, he found himself desperately clinging to the hope that this priest could offer him something, anything, to end the torment inside him. His heart raced as he made his way to the monastery where Padre Pio lived. Each step felt heavier than the last, but the flicker of hope that had sparked in him made him press on. He wasn't sure what to expect when he arrived, if Padre Pio would even have the time to see him, or if he would even be able to speak the words that had been choking him for so long. But he had to try. He had no other option. When he finally reached the monastery, Liam was struck by the stillness of the place. It was quiet, almost sacred, and the air seemed to carry a weight of reverence. He was guided into a small, humble room where Padre Pio sat, his gentle eyes filled with wisdom and compassion. Liam could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he approached the priest. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, guilt, and fear, and he wasn't sure where to begin. How could he explain the horrors that plagued him? How could he put into words the spiritual terror that had been eating away at his soul? Padre Pio, sensing the turmoil inside Liam, spoke first. "My son, I see the pain in your eyes. The weight you carry is heavy, and it presses down upon your soul. But you are not alone. God is always with you, even when you cannot feel his presence. You are here because you are seeking a way out of the darkness, and I am here to help you find it." Liam couldn't speak. The floodgates inside him opened, and tears began to flow freely. He had been holding back for so long, too afraid to face the reality of his sin, too ashamed to admit how far he had fallen. But now, in the presence of Padre Pio, he felt a strange sense of relief, like the very air around him was offering him comfort. Padre Pio continued, his voice calm yet firm. "The spiritual terror you feel is the result of your separation from God. Sin, my son, creates a chasm between you and your Creator. It darkens your soul, and it leaves you feeling empty, lost, and alone. But you must understand this. God never abandons you. You are the one who has turned away. But through confession, you can light the way back to Him. You can heal the wounds of your soul, and you can find peace." Liam sat there, listening intently, as the priest's words began to sink in. The weight on his chest didn't disappear immediately, but it lessened just enough for him to catch his breath. Could it really be that simple? Could confession truly lead him back to the light? Could God still love him even after everything he had done? For the first time in months, Liam allowed himself to hope. He wasn't sure how, but he believed Padre Pio. There was something in the priest's eyes, a depth of understanding, of compassion, that made him feel like he wasn't beyond saving. Maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to God. Padre Pio leaned forward, his gaze intense yet gentle. You must confront your sins, Liam. It is not easy, and it will not happen overnight, but you must face them head on. You must be honest with yourself, and you must be honest with God. Confession is the first step. But true healing requires more than just words. It requires a transformation of the heart. Liam nodded, still overwhelmed but beginning to feel a sense of clarity. For the first time, he didn't feel condemned. He didn't feel abandoned. He felt the weight of his sins, yes, but it was no longer a weight that crushed him. It was a burden he could lift with God's help. He was beginning to understand what Padre Pio meant. His sins had created a barrier between him and God, but through repentance and confession, that barrier could be broken. Padre Pio stood, placing a hand on Liam's shoulder. Do not be afraid, my son. God is merciful. His love is greater than any sin, and when you return to him, he will welcome you with open arms. You are not alone in this journey. You have the strength to overcome. You must only believe. Liam felt the tears fall again, but these were different. They weren't tears of despair. They were tears of release, of healing, of hope. He had been given a second chance, a chance to start over, to mend his brokenness. The path ahead would not be easy, but with the guidance of Padre Pio, with the power of confession, and with God's grace, Liam now believed that he could find his way back to the light. He stood up, wiping his eyes, and looked at Padre Pio with a sense of gratitude he could hardly express. Thank you, Liam whispered. I don't know what to say, but thank you? Padre Pio smiled warmly, as if he knew exactly what Liam was feeling. Go now, my son, and know that God's love will always be with you. It is never too late to turn back to him. As Liam left the monastery, the world outside seemed a little brighter. The terror that had once consumed him was still there, lurking in the background, but now it no longer had the power to control him. He had found a way forward, a way to heal, to change, and to reclaim the peace that had once seemed so distant. And as he walked away from the place that had given him hope, he couldn't help but wonder how many others out there were just like him, lost in their own darkness, yearning for a way back to God. If that's you, struggling with the weight of your own sins, don't give up. You're not beyond saving. Like Liam, you can find your way back to the light. And it starts with confronting your sins, seeking forgiveness, and allowing yourself to be healed. It's never too late to turn back to God, no matter how far you've strayed. If you've been touched by this story, I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Liam's journey resonated with you the most? Have you experienced a similar struggle in your own life? Let us know how this story has impacted you, and let's continue this conversation of hope, redemption, and healing together. Your comment could be the encouragement someone else needs to take the first step toward their own transformation. Liam awoke with a start, his heart racing as the memories of his past sins rushed back into his mind. The shadows of the night were still lingering in the corners of his room, but it wasn't the dark that unsettled him. It was the heaviness in his chest. It was as if the weight of everything he had done, every bad decision, every moment of weakness was pressing down on him, crushing his soul. He sat up slowly, wiping his face with his hands, his mind still clouded by the terrifying realization that his life had been consumed by sin. The darkness he had felt before, the guilt, the fear, the terror of being lost forever, he knew it was still there. Even after meeting Padre Pio, even after beginning to see the light of hope, it wasn't enough to erase the battle raging inside him. Liam had thought that the terror he'd felt would simply vanish once he turned to God. After all, hadn't Padre Pio told him that God's mercy was greater than any sin? Hadn't he reassured Liam that no matter how far he had fallen, God's love would always find a way to reach him? But the reality was different from what he had imagined. Redemption was not instantaneous, nor was it easy. It was a slow, painful process, a journey that Liam would have to walk every single day. Liam had made the decision to fight. After the encounter with Padre Pio, he knew that his only hope for peace lay in turning to God. But he didn't know how to begin. Where should he start? What should he do? How could he even begin to break free from the chains that had held him captive for so long? It wasn't long before Liam found himself turning to prayer. The words seemed clumsy at first, almost foreign to him, as if he had forgotten how to speak to the God he had once known. His prayers were simple, raw, and vulnerable. He asked for forgiveness, for strength, for guidance. And as he prayed, he felt the presence of God, not in a rush of emotion or in a grand revelation, but in a stillness that filled the air around him. The first time he went to confession after meeting Padre Pio was an overwhelming experience. The priest had listened patiently as Liam confessed his sins, speaking the words he had buried deep within his heart for so long. And when he finished, the priest absolved him, and Liam felt, for the first time in years, a weight lift from his soul. But the terror that had plagued him was not gone completely. It was like a dark cloud that lingered on the edges of his vision, threatening to return at any moment. Each day, Liam had to remind himself that this was a battle, a fight that would take time and effort. And the hardest part was the fight against himself. There were mornings when he woke up feeling strong, filled with the grace of God and the hope of redemption. But by the evening, the old temptations crept back into his life, dragging him back into the darkness. His mind wandered to the things that once consumed him, desires that had led him astray, actions that had left him with scars too deep to forget. The guilt and shame that had haunted him for so long still had a grip on his heart, pulling him into despair. But Liam was learning to fight back. With each prayer, with each moment of confession, he was slowly pushing the darkness away. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew the road ahead would be filled with obstacles, with moments of doubt, with times when he would fall again. But he had made a decision to fight for his redemption. One of the hardest battles he faced was the fight against fear. The terror that had once consumed him seemed to multiply when he least expected it. It would hit him in the quiet moments, in the stillness of his thoughts. What if God didn't forgive him? What if the terror he had felt would follow him forever? What if he could never truly escape the chains of his sin? These fears were like whispers in the dark, taunting him, telling him that he wasn't good enough, that he was beyond saving. It was as if every sin he had ever committed was a weapon used against him, reminding him of his failures, making him feel small, insignificant, unworthy of God's love. But in those moments of fear, Liam would recall the words of Padre Pio. He would remember the priest's calming presence, his unwavering confidence in God's mercy. God's grace is greater than any fear, Padre Pio had told him. When the fear of your sins tries to control you, remember this. It is not your fear that will save you, but God's love. Trust in that love, and you will find peace. Liam clung to those words, repeating them in his mind whenever the fear tried to take hold. And slowly, over time, the fear began to fade. It didn't disappear entirely, but it no longer had the power to paralyze him. With each passing day, Liam felt a little bit stronger, a little bit more confident that he could break free from the chains that had bound him. But the most difficult struggle was the battle against temptation. Temptation was relentless, always lurking just around the corner, always waiting for the moment when Liam was weakest. There were times when he would feel overwhelmed by the desires he had once given into so easily, moments when the temptation to sin felt so strong that he thought he might crumble under its weight. It was during these times that Liam turned to the support of Padre Pio, remembering the priest's words of encouragement and strength. "You are never alone in this fight," Padre Pio had assured him. "God is with you, and you have the power to resist the temptations of the world. But you must turn to him in your weakest moments, and he will give you the strength you need to overcome. And so Liam fought. He fought with all his might, knowing that every victory, no matter how small, brought him closer to redemption. He learned to pray in those moments of weakness, to call on God's strength when his own felt insufficient. And as he did, the temptation slowly began to lose its grip on him. Each time he resisted, each time he chose to turn away from sin, he felt a little bit more free. But even as he fought, Liam knew that this was not a battle he could fight alone. He continued to seek guidance from Padre Pio, meeting with the priest regularly for spiritual counsel. Padre Pio's wisdom was a steady anchor for Liam, grounding him in the truth of God's love and mercy. With each meeting, Liam's understanding of God's grace deepened, and his resolve to fight for his redemption grew stronger. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Liam began to see the fruits of his labor. The darkness that had once consumed him began to recede, and the terror that had once haunted him began to fade. It wasn't that the fear was gone. It was still there, lurking at the edges of his mind. But now, it no longer controlled him. He had learned to fight back with the strength that only God could provide. The road to redemption was long and arduous, but Liam was no longer walking it in fear. He had learned to trust in God's grace, to rely on his mercy, and to fight with everything he had to break free from the chains of sin. And with each step, he felt himself drawing closer to the peace he had longed for, the peace that only comes from being in the presence of God, free from the weight of guilt and shame. As he continued on his journey, Liam knew that the battle was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he believed that he could win. He had faith in God's love, and he knew that no matter how many times he stumbled, he could always rise again, because God's grace was always there to lift him up. Liam's struggle for redemption was far from easy, but it was the most important battle he would ever face. And in the end, it was a battle that would lead him not just to freedom from his sins, but to a deeper, more intimate relationship with God. Liam sat quietly, the silence surrounding him like a cloak. The light streaming through the small window of his room felt different today. It wasn't just the physical warmth of the sun on his skin. It was the warmth of something deeper, something more profound. His heart, which had once been weighed down by the darkness of his past, was now lighter, freer. He could feel it in his chest, in the calm rhythm of his breathing. There was peace now, something he had thought he could never feel again. The terror that had once consumed him was no more. It had been months since that fateful encounter with Padre Pio, months since he had begun his journey toward redemption. And while the road had been long and painful, filled with countless struggles and battles, Liam now found himself standing in a place he had never imagined possible, a place of purity and grace. The first days of his new life had been the hardest. Each step forward had felt like a battle, each moment of temptation a struggle for survival. But the grace of God had been with him, guiding him, strengthening him when he had been weak, and lifting him when he had fallen. With every prayer, every confession, every moment of self-reflection, Liam had learned to let go of the chains that had once bound him. He had learned to live according to God's plan, not his own. But the journey had been far from easy. There were days when the weight of his past sins seemed unbearable, days when the fear of falling back into temptation was overwhelming. There were moments when the old desires, the old ways of thinking would resurface, trying to drag him back into the darkness. But Liam had learned to recognize them for what they were, false promises of fleeting pleasure that led to nothing but emptiness. He had learned that true peace, true joy, could only be found in the embrace of God's love. In those moments of weakness, when his mind wandered back to the sins of his past, Liam would remember the words of Padre Pio. The light of God shines. Brightest in the darkest of places, Padre Pio had told him, you have come through the storm, but you must remain close to the light. Stay in prayer, stay in communion with God, and you will remain free. Those words had become his anchor, holding him steady as he navigated the storms of temptation. He would pray, turning to God in those moments of vulnerability, seeking his strength and guidance. And each time he did, he felt a little bit stronger, a little bit more rooted in the truth of God's love. The fear, the shame, the guilt, all of it began to fade as he embraced the grace that had been freely given to him. The transformation that Liam experienced was not just internal, it was evident in the way he lived his life. He began to see the world through new eyes, eyes that had been opened by the grace of God. Where once he had been consumed by selfish desires, he now saw the beauty in selflessness. Where once he had been trapped in the chains of lust, he now found freedom in purity. His heart, once darkened by sin, was now filled with the light of holiness. As he walked this new path, Liam encountered people who had known him before, people who remembered the man he used to be. They could see the change in him, the peace that now radiated from him. And it wasn't just his outward behavior that had changed, it was the way he carried himself, the way he spoke, the way he interacted with others. There was a calmness, a humility, a kindness in him that had never been there before. He began to volunteer at his local church, helping others who were struggling with the same temptations he had once faced. He shared his story with them, telling them about the terror he had felt and the grace of God that had saved him. He became a source of hope for those who were lost, just as Padre Pio had been for him. Liam's transformation was not just for himself, it was for others as well. But even as he embraced this new life, there were still moments of challenge. There were times when he would be tempted to return to old patterns, to slip back into old habits. But he had learned to recognize those temptations for what they were: lies, distractions from the truth. He knew that the path of purity was not one that could be walked passively. It required constant vigilance, constant self-awareness, and a deep commitment to God's will. And so, Liam continued to fight. Every day was a new opportunity to choose purity over sin, to choose God over the empty promises of the world. Each victory, no matter how small, was a triumph of grace. He didn't look back anymore. He didn't long for the things of his past. He had found something far better, a life rooted in God's love, a life free from the chains of sin. As he reflected on the journey that had brought him here, Liam couldn't help but marvel at the transformation. It was as if he had been reborn. He had gone from a man consumed by guilt and fear to a man walking in the light of God's grace. He had gone from a prisoner of his own desires to a man living in freedom. And though the road had been long, he knew that it had been worth it. Liam's life now was a life of peace, a peace that came not from the absence of struggle, but from the presence of God. He had learned that true peace does not come from avoiding challenges, but from trusting in God's grace through them. It was in the struggle, in the battle, that Liam had discovered the depth of God's love for him, and it was that love that had brought him to this place of purity and freedom. He knew that his journey was not over. He knew that there would always be more to learn, more battles to fight. But for the first time in his life, he was at peace with who he was. He was no longer haunted by the sins of his past. He had been forgiven. He had been set free. Liam's triumph of purity was not just the triumph of a man. It was the triumph of God's grace. And it was a triumph that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As we come to the end of Liam's powerful journey toward redemption, I want to take a moment to reflect on what we've experienced together. It's been a journey filled with heartache, terror, and struggle, but it's also been a story of triumph, grace, and transformation. A story that not only shows us the devastating impact sin can have on our lives, but also the profound power of God's love and the hope that lies in the path of redemption. Liam's life was once consumed by guilt and fear, trapped in the chains of his past sins. His spiritual terror, the voices in his head, and the darkness that surrounded him seemed impossible to escape. But despite how deep he had fallen, despite how much he had strayed from the light of God, he was not without hope. Through the grace of God and the wise guidance of Padre Pio, Liam discovered that there was always a way back. He found the courage to face his sins, to confess them, and to seek the forgiveness and healing that only God can provide. We saw how the road to redemption was not an easy one. It was filled with battles battles against temptation, battles against fear, and battles against his own doubts. But with each prayer, each confession, and each act of humility, Liam's soul grew, stronger. Slowly, the haunting terror that once consumed him began to fade. The voices that whispered lies in his ear lost their power, and in their place, a sense of peace began to settle in. Liam's transformation wasn't just spiritual, it was tangible. He walked through life with a new sense of purpose, a new way of seeing the world, and a new way of living. His heart, once filled with guilt and shame, was now filled with the light of God's grace. He became a living example of the power of repentance, of the freedom that comes from letting go of past mistakes, and of the peace that comes from walking in the light of holiness. But the story doesn't end there. The journey of redemption is ongoing. While Liam may have found peace, the battle to live a holy life is one he will have to continue fighting every day. And the same is true for all of us. We are all on a journey. We all face temptations, struggles, and moments of doubt. But as Liam's story shows us, there is always hope. No matter how far we have fallen, no matter how deep the sin, God's grace is greater. And it's never too late to turn back to Him. If Liam's story resonated with you today, then I want to invite you to continue this journey of discovery and transformation. This video is just one piece of a larger conversation about sin, redemption, and God's incredible mercy. If you're seeking more insight, more stories of struggle and victory, I encourage you to dive deeper into our channel. We have a playlist filled with similar stories, each one aimed at helping you recognize the power of God's love and how it can transform even the darkest parts of your life. In that playlist, you'll find stories about people just like Liam, people who faced deep despair and found hope through faith. You'll hear about how sin can keep us chained to a life of misery, but how God's grace offers us the chance to break free. And most importantly, you'll learn that no matter what you're going through, you are never beyond the reach of God's mercy. The path to redemption is never easy, but it is always worth it. And in these videos, you'll find practical advice, encouragement, and inspiration to keep moving forward no matter where you are on your own journey. Whether you're struggling with guilt, fear, temptation, or anything else, there is something here that will speak to you. Now, as we wrap up today's video, I want to hear from you. What did you think about Liam's journey? How does his story reflect your own struggles or triumphs? Have you ever experienced a moment where you felt trapped in sin, only to discover the freedom that comes from God's love? Or maybe you've been inspired to take a step toward redemption after watching this video. Whatever your thoughts are, I encourage you to leave a comment below. Your comment could be the encouragement someone else needs to start their own journey toward healing. Your story, your thoughts, and your reflections matter. Together, we can create a community of support, encouragement, and hope. So don't hesitate. Share what's on your heart. Also, make sure to check out the playlist linked here. It's a treasure trove of powerful stories, each one designed to help you deepen your understanding of God's grace and how it can change your life. Whether you're looking for guidance in your own journey or simply seeking inspiration, these videos are here to help you along the way. Remember, you are never alone in this journey. The struggles you face, the temptations you resist, and the triumphs you achieve are all part of a greater story, a story of redemption, transformation, and God's incredible love for you. Keep walking in faith, keep trusting in His grace, and keep fighting for that purity of heart that leads to true peace. Thank you for watching today. I hope this video has touched your heart and reminded you that no matter where you are, God's love is always within reach. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, and share this video with anyone who may need to hear this message. And remember, the journey to redemption is one we walk together.